Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with retired senior U.S. intelligence officers. And today we have a really special treat. I'm welcoming back to the program a good friend and former colleague from CIA's Near East Division. Sam Wyman has degrees from both Georgetown and Columbia University. He studied Arabic at Baghdad University, which he told us about in our last program. And he is a former CIA operations officer, chief of station and division chief with a background in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And currently, he is the vice chairman and chief operating officer of Jefferson Waterman International. Sam, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Very nice to be here, Jim. Very nice to recall old times together, playing in the Middle Eastern sandbox.
Sam, as we discussed off camera, since we're going to be scrolling back about 50 years in history, and some of this history is really shrouded in the mists of time, we thought it'd be good for me to provide a little bit of a background notes for our viewing audience as kind of a scene setter. So I'm going to take everybody back to Jordan in the period June to September of 1970. As everyone knows, after the 1948 and 1967 wars, many Palestinian refugees fled to one of the surrounding Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And there was a very large Palestinian presence in Jordan. Over time, the armed factions of this Palestinian presence became kind of a state within a state in Jordan, and were constituting a threat to stability. And this finally erupted into hostilities between armed Palestinians and the Jordanian armed forces. Ultimately, JAF forces actually surrounded Palestinian camps in and around Amman and elsewhere, shelled the camps. And then there were a series of battles that were conducted in and around Amman, and then further north between June and September, culminating in the Jordanian armed forces actually expelling armed Palestinians from Jordan in September of 1970, so-called Black September, Hilul al-Aswad. This led to the creation of one of the radical Palestinian organizations called the Black September Organization. And they began conducting a number of violent operations, initially targeted against Jordanian politicians and military leaders. Probably the best known operation was the assassination of Wasfi in summer of 1971 in Cairo, because Wasfi had been a commander of Jordanian forces. This also led to PLO, Fatah, and Palestinian fighters moving from Jordan through Syria and primarily into Lebanon, where they reestablished themselves and set up their headquarters in Beirut in southern Lebanon. Ultimately, that added radical Palestinian presence in southern Lebanon increased the tensions between various factions in Lebanon, which led to the Lebanese Civil War between 1975 and 1990. Initially, almost all of the BSO operations were targeted against Jordanian authorities, but over time, they refocused their efforts primarily against Israel, involved in a number of aircraft hijackings and other operations. Sam, you've got some personal history with that. You want to tell our audience a little bit about the one attempted aircraft hijacking that you had a personal experience with?
I will, but let me make a couple of other comments first on your historical summary. I think it's important that our listeners appreciate that in the months leading up to Black September 1970, it was stated PLO strategy to take over Jordan. And the effort of the behind the movement by armed Palestinians was essentially to establish the PLO as the primary governing force, if you will, in Jordan to either subjugate the king and the royal family or remove them. And fortunately, the Jordanian army and the Jordanian royal family realized this was happening before it got too far out of hand in the ultimate sense of the term, and thus created Black September when they expelled them, when the Jordanian armed forces expelled the PLO out of Jordan and into Syria and Lebanon, as you suggest. The arrival of large numbers of largely Muslim Palestinians into Lebanon specifically upset the sectarian balance that had been running Lebanon or governing Lebanon for decades prior to Black September. And the predominant Christians saw the demographic change as a mortal threat to their continued paramountcy in Lebanon. And this is essentially what led to the start of the launching of the Lebanese Civil War, when a group of armed Christian guerrillas, if you will, attacked a bus full of Palestinians, slaughtered them. That was in April of 75, and the rest of it was downhill and stayed downhill for the next 15 years of very bloody fighting. Now, as far as the atmosphere and the operating climate in Lebanon, I would say that by midsummer 1975, shootings, killings, ambushes, hijackings, carjackings were fairly constant fare throughout much of Beirut. They would flare up and then they would dissipate for a few days, and then they'd flare up again. It made operating in heretofore delightful, pleasant, idyllic Beirut a pretty dismal prospect. And in fairly short order, quote, non-essentials, unquote, were evacuated from Beirut because the PLO became in many respects, the fighting arm of the Sunni Muslims versus the Christians, whether it be Shamoun's Christians or any other number of groups that were either fighting among themselves for supremacy or fighting alongside each other against the Palestinians. As you may remember, Jim, I was there from June of 75 through to midsummer of 76. My family was evacuated from Beirut in November of 75, and they went off to Athens along with the rest of the station dependents. And we were left with a fairly hard core with Claire George as the chief of station, Charlie Waterman as deputy, myself, a couple of others, in an effort to report on what was going on and see if there wasn't some way we could resolve the Civil War issues by talking to both sides on behalf of the embassy and the State Department and as collectors of intelligence. I recall that to get from my apartment in West Beirut to the embassy, which in those days was West Beirut as well, there were 6 different checkpoints run by 6 different groups. No Christians on that side, all different Muslim groups. Some were Palestinian, some were Lebanese, the Shia hadn't really moved up from the south yet into West Beirut by that time. They were starting to flow in, but it hadn't really happened yet. But nevertheless, it made moving around, meeting assets, supporting assets, keeping an eye on what was happening. It made it kind of tricky. And we used to joke a little bit to make sure about making sure that we had something in our vehicles, if we were doing a car pickup or something, that would be of value to a potential carjacker or kidnapper, such as a set of golf clubs in the trunk. Remember, Jeff O'Connell lost his golf clubs because it was the only thing that saved another case officer who was using Jeff's car and got stopped at a checkpoint, was able to offer up the golf clubs in exchange for letting him go. So we began to joke a bit about make sure you have a flashy, cheap gold watch on or something that you could offer to your potential kidnappers, and they would let you go in exchange for the watch. I don't know what happened after they figured out the watches were largely Chinese fakes, but anyhow, the tradecraft and whatnot became literally a matter of life and death on occasion, as well as operational security. You thought very, very carefully about the routes you were taking and where you would ask somebody to be to meet you or how you would set up a meeting. We developed some pretty interesting types of covert communications to alert assets to the need for a meeting or short burst stratcom for quick reporting. The fighting between the, shall we say, the Christian side and the Muslim side became pretty intense, and particularly between the Christians based up in the mountains and the various Muslim groups, but down primarily in West Beirut and along the Green Line that separated the West from the East. Unfortunately, the apartment building that I lived in and Jeff O'Connell lived in was right in the direct line of fire between a Christian battery in the mountains at Beit Mary and a Marabitoun battery down in the Ban Militaire on the coast in West Beirut below our apartment. Most of the time, it was their harrowing atmosphere was the sound of these artillery shells going back and forth. And if you've ever heard one, you'll never forget it. It's like a railway locomotive coming right through your window. We used to joke that as long as you could hear it, you were okay. Because when you couldn't hear it, you were in trouble. And unfortunately, both the Christians and the Marabitoun were not the best targeteers because I think the top of our building took direct hits a couple of times, at least once from incoming Christian rounds and another outgoing from a Muslim round. And that top floor of the building had several holes through it. Let's put it that way. And when that happened, you really knew you were right in the middle of the conflict. And one ended up spending most of one's time hovered or hunkered down in your bathroom because that's where you had four walls that could provide pretty solid protection. We had some Christian assets that were based in the Christian side of the city, which meant if we couldn't contact them if the electricity was out or your telephones had been destroyed, you had to go to make personal meetings, and which meant driving across the Green Line that separated the West from the East. This meant, in those days, driving along something known then as the fish trap, because there was only one way to get across. You either went through the port, which was blocked off by the Muslims, or you went through this, quote, fish trap, unquote, which no longer exists. It's now a fancy overpass built by Rafiq Hariri. But the Muslims on the west could see you coming, and the Christians on the east would see you coming, whichever way you were going. And so we ended up with driving armored Dodge Chargers or Chryslers, which we had a few of in the embassy, and essentially hunkering down with our heads barely above the dashboard so we could just barely see where we were going until we got through the fish trap. You get out the other side and you were safe, or you thought you were anyway. Did that about a half a dozen times, and fortunately I can still hear to talk about it. But the booming and the banging was fairly constant, and moving around the city to make meetings, to pay assets, keep reporting going. We did it, but it was fairly nerve-wracking, I'll put it that way. It was kind of fun because it kept the blood going and the adrenaline was pumping. But and I think it served a purpose because we really knew what was going on and we could keep Washington informed in quite great detail about what was happening on all sides. Fortunately, Bob Ames had developed a relationship with Ali Hassan Salameh and turned that relationship over to Charlie Waterman. And we had a excellent window into machinations on the Palestinian side. And through Ali Hassan, we also had a window on the machinations of the Muslim side of the conflict, because the Ali Hassan Salameh was in charge of Office 17, which was Fatah's operational arm on behalf of Arafat. And we had pretty good contacts on the Christian side as well, through the Shamoons and others. So we could keep pretty close tabs on who was doing what to whom on a larger, more strategic basis. I think that sort of sets kind of the background, Jim.
Yeah, Sam, that's a great background setter for our audience to kind of put them in the picture and help them understand what was going on at that time. So Ali Hassan Salameh in the early 70s created Force 17, which became the intelligence and security arm of Fatah and ultimately Yasser Arafat's personal security organization. As Sam mentioned, a former CIA operations officer from Beirut Station developed a relationship with Ali Hassan Salameh. And then that relationship was turned over and meetings were actually held in Beirut. Sam, you want to tell the audience a little bit about what it was like to meet with Ali Hassan in Beirut?
I was fortunate to be Ali Hassan's handler for several months from late 75 through early summer 76. Got to know him quite well. He was an extraordinary individual, very intelligent, very macho, very physically fit, the kind of person, as my wife, who met him once, described. He's the kind of person, when he walked into the room, he took the breath away. He sucked up all the oxygen. It was his personality. He wasn't overbearing. He was just a person very much in charge of himself and his surroundings. I emphasize he was extremely intelligent. He was Arafat's crown prince in many respects. He was either the son or the grandson of one of the great Palestinian struggle heroes, Al Hassan Salameh, who was well known in the history of Palestinian efforts to establish a state and fight the British and fight the French and anybody else who wanted to control the Palestinians. So he was a crown prince as well as a revered. Ali Hassan was a crown prince as well as a revered figure in Palestinian lore. He enjoyed the complete trust of Arafat. It really was a father-son relationship. It was well known and accepted that when Arafat passed away, Ali Hassan would succeed him as leader, the Palestinian leader, certainly leader of the PLO. There were challengers to that role, but they didn't last very long. I emphasize that Ali was quite intelligent. He also had a worldview that was relatively unique among your Palestinian operations types, because he could see the big picture. He did want to see a peaceful settlement, if you will. He believed it was possible to work out some sort of peaceful arrangement between among the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Israelis. And although he was a master practitioner of the use of terror and terror operations, he did, I think, believe sincerely that violence was only a tool. It was not a way of life. I don't know if that answers your question, Jim, but...
Describe a meeting for us, Sam. What was it like to meet Ali Hassan in Beirut in those days?
Well, the meetings that I had with him took place in my apartment. He came to those meetings, wasn't trying to hide his role, his presence. He also wasn't terribly interested in hiding his trail, because he was unique in the sense that he believed he was above it all. He knew the Israelis were after him, but he said they'll never get me. He practiced very poor personal security tradecraft, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, it got to the point where I said, look, when you're coming to see me, please don't have a Doshka truck going in front of you and a Doshka truck coming behind you with sirens blaring, because I don't want people to know that you're coming up to see me. And if you do that, please park somewhere else and walk over. But we would meet in my apartment late at night. The concierge of the building once stopped me and said, you think you could meet somewhere else? So this fellow didn't come to the building. Anyhow, we met. I would say we met probably at least once a week, maybe once every 10 days. He was completely open with me. I was fortunate to have very good intelligence on my side so that I knew when he might be overstating a situation or perhaps misrepresenting a situation, and I could get him back on track. This worked to our benefit a couple of times. There was once when one of our Christian assets called me on the phone while I was having a meeting with Ali Hassan and said that was complaining and asking the Americans to do something to stop Palestinian tanks coming over the mountains from Syria with Syrian troops. And Ali was standing right next to me when I got this phone call. He didn't know who I was talking to, but I put my hand over the receiver and I looked over at Ali and I said, "Have you got tanks coming over the hill?" And he made a quick phone call, said, "No, not ours." So I was able to get back to the Christian and say, "You better check your information because it's not accurate." Now, you may well say, why did I believe Ali and I didn't believe the Christian? I said, it's gotten to the point where I would believe him on something like that because his information had been checking out all along. He, as we all know, he was the mastermind behind the planning of the Munich 1972 hit against the Olympics, that horrible, horrible slaughter of Israeli athletes. And the war between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or between the Israelis and PLO, and specifically the BSO, really moved into high gear thereafter. It was when the Israelis created their special operation to bring down all of those involved in the planning of that operation, and Ali Hassan was at the top of the list. And as some of you may recall, there was an effort to assassinate a Palestinian whom the Israelis thought was Ali Hassan in Lillehammer. And it turned out it wasn't Ali Hassan. And this created a lot of bad water for the Israelis, but it also showed to the Palestinians how intent the Israelis were on getting after their leadership.
Sam, before we get into the Israeli retaliation that they call wrath of God, can you characterize for our audience what was the importance of the relationship to the U.S. government and to the CIA, and what kind of insights did we get into kind of the senior leadership of PLO, Fatah, and what was going on inside Palestinian organizations?
Well, I don't remember any specifics, but I do remember that we felt pretty confident that we knew what was going on inside the leadership of the PLO and inside Black September and so on. Ali Hassan was not our only asset in that regard. We had 3 or 4 run from Beirut, a couple of whom would tell us what Ali Hassan was doing and things that Ali Hassan wasn't telling us himself, but they were our penetrations of the Palestinian leadership, separate from and alongside Ali Hassan. We had a pretty good idea of what Arafat was thinking, in part from Ali Hassan, but also from these others. As you know, at that time, the U.S. government, or at least the State Department and the CIA, were enjoined by Kissinger from having any direct contact with the PLO. And so this relationship, clandestine relationship with Ali Hassan, was extremely sensitive from a U.S. political point of view, as well as from the point of view of U.S.-Israeli relations. And we felt, at least in Beirut Station, and I think in any division, we felt pretty confident that we knew what was happening and we knew what the PLO leadership was thinking. We used the channel not so much as a direct way to pass messages to Arafat per se, but our discussions with Ali, we knew would be summarized, gisted, be the basis for discussions that Ali himself would have with Arafat and other leaders. And so our efforts or the U.S. government's efforts to, shall we say, guide the direction of Palestinian activities were facilitated by the use of this channel to push ideas toward Arafat. It may well be that Ali Hassan told Arafat that he had specifically heard X, Y, and Z from me or from Charlie or from somebody else. I don't know that per se, but I'm assuming it. But nevertheless, we used Ali Hassan as a voice for reason, we hoped, monitoring the Palestinian approaches to various political developments in the area. Ali Hassan met with Vernon Walters at one point secretly and committed to Walters that if Arafat would support the peace plan, which was underway at that time, he would ask Ali Hassan and his people to protect Americans in West Beirut as a way to facilitate the ongoing efforts to find a peaceful settlement. And Walters got a commitment from Arafat at that time, which was then implemented by Ali Hassan, to provide protection to Americans in West Beirut, including the embassy. This came to fruition when the Americans were evacuated from Beirut in the summer of 76. Ali facilitated a convoy going to the port where American citizens, not U.S. government necessarily, but American citizens living in Beirut were helped to leave the country via sea. A second convoy, but by road, was facilitated by Ali, in which I drove the remains of the assassinated American ambassador and economic counselor. I drove their remains out of Beirut to Damascus through the Shuf Valley. Ali told me, look, I can protect you as long as you're in Palestinian lines. Once you get across those lines and get into Syrian territory, you're out of my hands. But I can get you as far as the Shuf and into the Shuf, which he did. A couple of firefights getting us through the Syrian lines, but we got through. I had a great big, huge American flag over the top of the van in which the two coffins were secured. I think that helped us get through, but it was rather fast over broken field driving to get through that line. Nevertheless, we did and got up to Damascus and everything was fine. And the Americans got out through the port. The other convoy got out through the port. So, and I met Ali a couple of times thereafter. I recall turning him over to Frank Anderson at one point. It was an exciting, very exciting agent handling responsibility.
And then for our audience's benefit, if we fast forward a little bit to January of 1979, of course, Ali Hassan was assassinated by the Israelis during a Mossad operation in Beirut as part of Wrath of God. I know you don't have any personal knowledge of that, but did you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Well, as I'd mentioned earlier, Ali had little regard for his own personal security. He knew the Israelis were after him. I told him time and again to be careful, to watch his trail, because it was just going to be just a matter of time before the Israelis would mount a hit against him. And he said, they can't do it. They can't do it. He he was very, very arrogant in that regard. And he did nothing to cover his tracks. There is no counter surveillance runs or anything along that line. He always took the same route in the same vehicle with the same security fore and aft. And we all, I'm sure most people know the story of the lady who sat on the balcony overlooking the route that he took and was able to trigger the bombs, explosives loaded in a VW Beetle parked along the street that effectively decapitated Ali Hassan. The Israelis asked the agency and the U.S. government many times to confirm that Ali Hassan was our agent. We refused. And to my knowledge, we never officially acknowledged that Ali Hassan was our asset. He was never a recruited asset, never a recruited paid agent, although there were those in the agency who wanted him to be a recruited agent and insisted that a recruitment effort be tried, which failed and almost lost us the relationship. During the early 73, there was an effort to formally recruit him. He rejected it, broke contact with us for a while. In fact, he pulled off an operation in August of 73 against TWA in Athens airport to show his disdain at the effort to suborn him and Palestinian movement to American policy.
Sam, you have some personal experience with that TWA operation in Athens. Would you like to tell the audience about that?
Well, as fate had it, that summer I had been on vacation with my family. I was stationed in Saudi Arabia. I had been on vacation with my family in Greece and had been called back to meet with a Saudi asset who had signaled for an emergency meeting, so to speak. And I was on my way back from Athens to Beirut to pick up a plane to go to Saudi Arabia. And we were standing, it was Middle East Airlines check-in counter, which just happened to be next to the TWA check-in counter that came under attack. And machine guns and bombs and so on. My memory is a little bit vague of it now. The first thing I remember was shoving my wife and daughter underneath a bench in the departure lounge. Booming and banging was going on. We were able to get out without being hurt, but several people were killed in the TWA line right next door to us. It was a harrowing experience, I will say. Fortunately, we got out okay.
Well, Sam, this has been really a unique opportunity to hear a firsthand account of really some very, very memorable history for both CIA and the Near East Division. If our audience is interested in reading more about that history, there are several books that Sam and I can recommend for you. One is the novel by David Ignatius called Agents of Innocence. Another is a biography of the CIA operations officer, a colleague of ours, Bob Ames, called The Good Spy. And finally, there's a book about the Munich massacre called One Day in September by Simon Reeve. So you might want to take a look at one or more of those. I want to thank my good friend Sam. This has been really a historic opportunity, and I'm sure our audience will really enjoy it.
Thank you, Jim. So nice to sort of go back down memory lane, even if it's kind of sad sometimes. But
yeah, as you said before we began recording, there's a lot of sand between our toes.
Right. Okay.